The sharp command cut through the quiet afternoon like a jagged blade. "Just clean and leave, janitor," the principal ordered, with a voice so cold it could freeze fire. The janitor's hands tightened around his mop handle, his face paling as if the words had drained the color from his very soul. Then, silence swallowed the room. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're sweeping a hallway, checking cameras, or locking the building for the night. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise you, today's story will shake you. This is the story of George Miller, a man whose tired eyes held more wisdom than any diploma hanging on the walls of Lincoln High School in downtown Chicago. For 23 years, George had walked those corridors before dawn, his footsteps a quiet percussion against polished linoleum floors that stretched like rivers through the maze of classrooms and administrative offices. His world began at 4:30 each morning, when the city still slept under a blanket of stars, and the only sounds were distant sirens and the occasional rumble of early delivery trucks navigating the streets of the windy city. George's uniform was always the same: navy blue workshirt with his name embroidered in fading white thread, khaki pants worn soft from countless washes, and black steel-toed boots that had walked thousands of miles within these same walls. His tool belt carried the essentials of his invisible kingdom: keys that unlocked secrets, a small flashlight that had illuminated dark corners for over a decade, and a worn leather wallet containing a single photograph of his late wife, Ellen, whose smile had been his anchor through years of thankless labor. The building itself was a testament to Chicago's educational heritage: red brick facade weathered by harsh winters, tall windows that caught the morning light streaming across Lake Michigan, and hallways that echoed with the dreams and disappointments of generations of students. George knew every inch of this place: which locker doors stuck in humid weather, where the old radiators leaked steam, and exactly how many steps it took to walk from the basement boiler room to the principal's office on the 3rd floor. 237 steps, to be precise. His routine was sacred ritual. Each morning, he would unlock the main entrance with the heavy brass key that had been entrusted to him when the previous janitor, old Mr. Kowalski, had finally retired to his small apartment in Pilsen. George would then begin his methodical journey through the building, switching on lights that revealed empty classrooms where tomorrow's lessons waited in silence, checking that windows were secure, and ensuring that the American flag in each room hung properly, a detail that mattered more to him than anyone realized. The smell of his work was a symphony of industrial fragrances: pine-scented floor cleaner that reminded him of the Wisconsin forests where he'd grown up, the metallic tang of the keys on his ring, and the faint aroma of chalk dust that lingered despite the school's transition to whiteboards and smart screens. His hands, calloused and strong, moved with practiced efficiency as he mopped floors that would soon be scuffed by hundreds of young feet, wiped down desks where students would rest their dreams, and emptied wastebaskets filled with discarded homework and forgotten aspirations. But George's greatest talent was not in cleaning, it was in seeing. 23 years of invisibility had sharpened his powers of observation to a razor's edge. He knew which teachers stayed late because of troubled marriages, which administrators counted money behind closed doors, and which students needed an extra smile on particularly difficult days. His presence was so constant, so unremarkable, that people spoke freely around him as if he were simply another piece of furniture, another fixture in the institutional landscape of education. Principal Margaret Thompson had arrived at Lincoln High 5 years earlier, her expensive shoes clicking against George's freshly waxed floors like a countdown to conflict. She was a woman who wore power like perfectly tailored armor. Designer suits that cost more than George's monthly salary, jewelry that caught light like tiny suns, and a smile that never quite reached her calculating eyes. Her office was a shrine to her ambitions: framed degrees from prestigious universities, photographs with Chicago's political elite, and a mahogany desk that had cost more than some families spent on rent. Thompson treated George with the casual dismissiveness reserved for those she considered beneath her notice. To her, he was simply part of the building's infrastructure, as interchangeable as light bulbs or doorknobs. She never learned his last name, never inquired about his well-being, and certainly never acknowledged the dedication it took to maintain her pristine educational empire. When she passed him in the hallways, her eyes would slide right through him, as if he were made of the same transparent glass as the windows he cleaned. The other faculty members followed Thompson's lead, treating George with polite indifference at best and outright condescension at worst. They spoke around him, over him, through him, discussing budget meetings, student issues, and personal gossip, as if his ears were as invisible as the rest of him. Only Mrs. Rodriguez, the elderly Spanish teacher whose gratitude was genuine, and Mr. Chen, the quiet librarian who always said good morning, treated George with basic human dignity. George's apartment in the working-class neighborhood of Back of the Yards was a small sanctuary filled with memories of Ellen and the modest life they had built together. The walls were decorated with photographs from their 42-year marriage, their wedding day at St. Barbara's Church, vacations to Wisconsin lakes, Ellen's retirement party from the Postal Service. His evenings were spent reading library books, mysteries mostly, though he had a secret passion for biographies of people who had overcome great obstacles, and listening to jazz music on an old radio that Ellen had given him for their 20th anniversary. His financial situation was precarious but stable. The janitor's salary of $32,000 annually was supplemented by occasional weekend work cleaning office buildings downtown, money he saved carefully in a small account at the neighborhood credit union. He had no investments, no cryptocurrency portfolio, no stocks or bonds, just the modest pension that would barely cover his basic needs when retirement finally came. Yet George's wealth was not measured in dollars or assets. It was measured in the quiet satisfaction of a work done well and the knowledge that his invisible labor kept an entire institution functioning smoothly. The turning point came on a gray October afternoon when the school was buzzing with excitement about the annual foundation fundraiser. Lincoln High's Educational Foundation had received a significant donation, $50,000 in cash from an anonymous benefactor, money that was supposed to fund new technology for the computer lab and renovations to the aging auditorium. The donation had arrived in an unmarked envelope, delivered to Principal Thompson's office with no return address, just a simple note expressing support for the school's mission. George had been cleaning the administrative hallway that afternoon, his mop gliding silently across the floor as he moved from office to office. He noticed the unusual activity, Thompson's door closed, urgent phone calls, the subdued excitement of faculty members who spoke in hushed tones about the unexpected windfall. He had also noticed something else, a small piece of paper that had fallen beneath Thompson's desk, a fragment of what looked like correspondence that mentioned Bitcoin transfers and offshore accounts. 2 days later, the $50,000 vanished. Thompson's reaction was swift and brutal. Rather than conducting a methodical investigation, rather than examining security procedures or questioning those with access to her office safe, she immediately turned her suspicion toward the most vulnerable target in the building. George was summoned to her office on a Friday afternoon, his cleaning cart left abandoned in the hallway as he climbed those familiar 237 steps with a sense of foreboding that proved tragically accurate. "George," Thompson began, her voice sharp as broken glass, "we need to discuss the missing foundation money." He stood before her massive desk, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture respectful but wary. The office smelled of her expensive perfume and the leather of her executive chair, scents that seemed to mock the simplicity of his work clothes. "I don't know anything about missing money, Mrs. Thompson," George replied quietly, his voice steady despite the tremor of anxiety in his chest. "You have access to this office," she continued, her accusation building like a thunderstorm. "You're here after hours when no one else is around. You could have seen the combination to the safe." The injustice of her words hit him like a physical blow. 23 years of faithful service, of never taking so much as a pen from supply closets, of going above and beyond his duties without complaint or recognition, all of it dismissed in a few sentences that painted him as a common thief. "I would never steal from this school," George said, his dignity intact despite the crumbling ground beneath his feet. "This place has been my life's work." "Your life's work?" Thompson's laugh was cold and cutting. "George, you're a janitor. You push a mop around and empty trash cans. Let's not pretend this is some noble calling." The words were designed to wound, and they found their mark. George felt something break inside his chest, not his spirit exactly, but his faith in the basic decency he had believed existed even in the most difficult people. He saw himself suddenly through her eyes, not as a dedicated employee, not as a human being with feelings and dignity, but as the expendable piece of equipment that had somehow malfunctioned. Without any evidence beyond suspicion and prejudice, Thompson placed George on immediate suspension. The news spread through the school like wildfire, whispered conversations in faculty lounges, sideways glances from teachers who had worked alongside him for years. Some expressed quiet doubt about his guilt, but none spoke up in his defense. Fear of Thompson's wrath, concern for their own positions, and the uncomfortable realization that they had never really seen George as fully human combined to create a wall of silence around his disgrace. The suspension became termination within a week. Thompson called it a mutual separation, a bureaucratic euphemism that barely disguised the reality of his dismissal. On his last day, George gathered his few personal belongings from the maintenance office, the photograph of Ellen, his worn coffee thermos, a small plant that Mrs. Rodriguez had given him for his birthday 3 years earlier. As he walked toward the exit, carrying his possessions in a cardboard box, he could feel the weight of judgmental stares and whispered conversations. "Just clean and leave, janitor," Thompson had said during their final encounter, the words delivered with such disdain that they seemed to echo off the walls of the building he had called home for more than 2 decades. She stood in her office doorway, arms crossed, watching him with the satisfaction of someone who believed she had solved a problem by eliminating its most convenient scapegoat. George left Lincoln High School that day with his head held high, his spine straight despite the burden of false accusation. He walked through the corridors he had maintained with such care, past classrooms where he had quietly supported the education of thousands of students, beyond the administrative offices where his presence had been ignored for so many years. The October wind was cold against his face as he stepped onto the sidewalk, turning for one last look at the building that had defined his adult life. But George Miller was not a man who accepted injustice quietly, and he was certainly not the simple-minded janitor that Margaret Thompson believed him to be. His years of invisible observation had taught him that truth has a way of revealing itself to those patient enough to wait and wise enough to recognize it when it appears. As he walked away from Lincoln High School, George carried with him something far more valuable than the modest belongings in his cardboard box. He carried the truth. During his 23 years at Lincoln High, George had developed the habit of discretion that comes naturally to those whose job requires them to witness the private moments of others. He had seen teachers crying in empty classrooms, administrators making personal calls during work hours, and students struggling with problems that extended far beyond academic challenges. His policy had always been simple: observe, remember, but never repeat unless absolutely necessary. But recent months had brought a troubling change to the atmosphere at Lincoln High. George had noticed an increase in closed-door meetings, hushed conversations that stopped when he entered rooms, and a general air of secrecy that seemed centered around Principal Thompson's office. His natural curiosity, combined with a growing sense that something was not right, had led him to pay closer attention to these unusual activities. 3 weeks before the donation disappeared, George had been cleaning the conference room adjacent to Thompson's office when he overheard a heated telephone conversation. Thompson's voice, usually so controlled and professional, carried a note of anxiety that immediately caught his attention. She was speaking to someone about the arrangement, about ensuring discretion, and about money that had to be moved carefully to avoid questions. George's instincts, honed by decades of careful observation, told him to remember every detail. He began carrying a small notebook, the kind sold in corner stores for $1, tucked into his shirt pocket. During his rounds, he would jot down brief observations, dates, times, unusual visitors, fragments of overheard conversations. It wasn't espionage, exactly. It was simply the methodical documentation that came naturally to a man whose life had been built on paying attention to details others missed. The missing donation was not the first financial irregularity George had noticed. Over the past year, he had observed a pattern of unusual cash payments, anonymous donations that arrived without fanfare, and budget discussions that seemed deliberately vague. The school's foundation, supposedly managed by a board of community volunteers, appeared to be under Thompson's direct control in ways that struck George as unusual for an educational institution. On the day the $50,000 vanished, George had been cleaning the administrative wing as he did every Tuesday and Friday. He had seen the armored car delivery earlier that morning, watched as the funds were transferred to Thompson's office safe, and noted the unusual security measures that accompanied the transaction. But he had also seen something else, something that Thompson apparently did not realize he had witnessed. Around 3:30 that afternoon, as George was emptying wastebaskets in the guidance counselor's office, he had observed a well-dressed man leaving through the school's rear exit. The man was tall, wearing an expensive gray suit, and carrying a leather briefcase that seemed unusually heavy for its size. What made the observation significant was the timing. The man had left the building approximately 30 minutes before Thompson discovered the money was missing. George had seen this same man twice before, always entering and leaving through the rear entrance, always during hours when most staff had gone home. On both previous occasions, the man's visits had coincided with closed-door meetings in Thompson's office and subsequent changes to the school's financial procedures. George's mental file on this mysterious visitor was thin but troubling. Mid-50s, expensive clothes, behavior that suggested familiarity with the building's layout, and a manner of movement that spoke of someone conducting business that required discretion. But George's most significant observation had come by pure chance, the result of a maintenance issue that had required him to access the crawl space beneath Thompson's office. While investigating a persistent water leak, George had discovered something unexpected, a small gap in the office's floorboards that created an inadvertent listening post. Sound from Thompson's office carried clearly through this architectural accident, and on 2 occasions, George had overheard conversations that painted a disturbing picture of financial manipulation. The first conversation had involved Thompson and an unidentified male voice discussing what sounded like money laundering through the school's foundation. Terms like cryptocurrency conversion, offshore transfers, and untraceable donations had floated through the floorboards like smoke signals of corruption. The second conversation, occurring just 3 days before the donation disappeared, had been even more explicit. Planning sessions about how to relocate assets and eliminate potential witnesses to the arrangement. George understood that his accidental eavesdropping had placed him in a precarious position. He was now in possession of information that could potentially expose serious financial crimes, but he was also acutely aware of his vulnerable position as a working-class employee with no political connections or institutional support. His dismissal following the missing donation was not, he realized, a coincidence. It was a calculated move to eliminate the one person who might have observed too much. The weeks following his termination were among the most difficult of George's life. The small savings account that had provided modest security was rapidly depleted by job search expenses and the basic costs of living without steady income. His unemployment benefits provided barely enough to cover rent and groceries, leaving no room for the small pleasures that had made his modest life bearable: library fines, the occasional movie, the coffee shop visits that had been his weekly treat. But the financial hardship was nothing compared to the social isolation. Word of his suspected theft had somehow spread beyond Lincoln High School, making him virtually unemployable in his field. Other schools, office buildings, and institutions that might have hired an experienced maintenance worker were reluctant to take a chance on someone with even a whisper of dishonesty in his background. George found himself facing the reality that his reputation, built over decades of faithful service, had been destroyed by a few sentences of unfounded accusation. The loneliness was crushing. Ellen had been gone for 8 years, but during his time at Lincoln High, the daily interactions with students and faculty had provided a social structure that kept isolation at bay. Now, his days stretched endlessly, filled with unsuccessful job applications and the growing realization that his life's work had been reduced to a single moment of false accusation. Yet George's greatest strength had always been his patience, and his greatest skill had been his ability to observe and remember. As autumn turned to winter, as his situation became increasingly desperate, he began to formulate a plan that would either restore his reputation or provide closure to the injustice that had upended his life. The plan began with memory. George sat at his small kitchen table, surrounded by the few possessions he had brought home from Lincoln High, and began to reconstruct everything he had observed over the past year. Using his dollar store notebook and his methodical approach to detail, he created a timeline of unusual events, suspicious conversations, and financial irregularities that painted a comprehensive picture of corruption at the school. His documentation was meticulous. Dates, times, individuals involved, amounts discussed, and patterns of behavior that suggested systematic fraud. George understood that his word alone, especially given his current circumstances, would carry little weight against someone of Thompson's position and influence. But he also understood that patterns of evidence, carefully documented and corroborated by objective facts, could tell a story that even the most skeptical observer would find difficult to dismiss. The breakthrough came in December, 3 months after his dismissal, when George decided to visit Lincoln High one final time. Not to confront Thompson or to plead for reinstatement, but to retrieve something he had hidden months earlier in a moment of prescient caution. During his final weeks of employment, when the atmosphere of secrecy had become particularly thick, George had made a decision that would prove crucial. Using a small digital recorder that he had purchased with overtime pay, the same device he had once used to record Ellen's voice during her final illness, George had begun secretly documenting the conversations he overheard through the gap in Thompson's office floor. The recordings were limited and sometimes unclear, but they captured enough to establish a pattern of criminal activity. Thompson's voice, discussing Bitcoin transfers, references to cleaning money through the school foundation, and most damning of all, a conversation about eliminating the maintenance problem that posed a risk to their operation. George realized with a chill that the maintenance problem was himself, that his dismissal had not been simply about the missing $50,000, but about silencing a witness who had seen too much. But retrieving the recorder from its hiding place required careful planning. Lincoln High's security system had been upgraded following the theft, and George's key access had been terminated along with his employment. However, his 23 years in the building had taught him things about its layout and vulnerabilities that no security consultant could anticipate. On a cold December evening, when the building would be empty except for the night security guard, a man George knew took long breaks to smoke cigarettes in the parking lot. George returned to Lincoln High School for the last time. He entered through a basement window that he knew had a faulty latch, navigated familiar corridors in darkness, and retrieved the digital recorder from its hiding place behind a loose panel in the maintenance office. But George discovered something else during his covert return visit, evidence that Thompson's operation was far more sophisticated than he had imagined. In her office, left carelessly on the desk during what she assumed was a secure evening, were documents that revealed the scope of the financial fraud. The school foundation was being used to launder money from multiple sources, with donations being converted to cryptocurrency and then transferred to offshore accounts. The $50,000 that had cost George his job was apparently just one small transaction in a much larger criminal enterprise. George photographed the documents with Ellen's old camera, the same device they had used to capture memories during happier times. The irony was not lost on him. A camera that had once preserved moments of love and joy was now documenting evidence of greed and corruption. Armed with his recordings, photographs, and meticulously documented timeline, George faced a crucial decision. He could attempt to present his evidence to local authorities, though his credibility as a disgraced former employee would make this approach uncertain. He could try to find a journalist willing to investigate the story, though his lack of connections in the media made this option challenging. Or he could wait, watching and planning until the perfect moment presented itself to reveal the truth in a way that could not be ignored or dismissed. George chose patience, the same quality that had sustained him through 23 years of invisible service. He returned to his small apartment, organized his evidence with the same methodical care he had once applied to maintaining Lincoln High, and began the careful process of planning his revelation. But as winter deepened and his financial situation became increasingly desperate, George began to understand that justice delayed might become justice denied. His unemployment benefits had run out, his savings were nearly exhausted, and the physical and emotional toll of his ordeal was beginning to show in ways that concerned his few remaining friends. Mrs. Rodriguez had visited once, bringing homemade tamales and gentle inquiries about his well-being, but even her kindness could not bridge the gulf created by his supposed disgrace. The break George needed came from an unexpected source. Detective Maria Santos of the Chicago Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit had been investigating a series of money laundering operations that used nonprofit organizations as fronts for criminal activity. Her investigation had identified several suspicious patterns involving educational foundations, and Lincoln High School's foundation had appeared on her radar as a potential link in a larger criminal network. Detective Santos was a woman who understood the value of patient investigation and reliable witnesses. When George finally made contact with her office through a carefully worded phone call that referenced specific details about cryptocurrency transactions and offshore accounts, she recognized immediately that he possessed information that could be crucial to her broader investigation. Their first meeting took place at a small diner on Chicago's South Side, a neutral location where they could talk without attracting attention. George arrived carrying Ellen's old purse, now serving as his briefcase, containing the evidence he had gathered during months of careful observation and documentation. Detective Santos was initially skeptical. Disgruntled former employees often made accusations against their former supervisors, and financial crimes were notoriously difficult to prove without extensive corroborating evidence. But as George methodically presented his timeline, played segments of his recordings, and explained the technical details of what he had observed, her skepticism transformed into respectful attention. "Mr. Miller," she said after reviewing his evidence for nearly 2 hours, "you've documented what appears to be a sophisticated money laundering operation. This information could be invaluable to our investigation, but I need you to understand the risks involved in coming forward as a witness." George nodded, understanding perfectly. His decision to speak truth to power would make him a target for people who had already demonstrated their willingness to destroy his reputation to protect their criminal enterprise. But his choice had been made months earlier, in the moment when he walked out of Lincoln High School, carrying his dignity intact, despite the injustice that had been done to him. "Detective Santos," George replied, his voice steady with the conviction of a man who had found his purpose, "I've spent my life taking care of things that other people didn't want to see. This is just one more mess that needs to be cleaned up." The investigation that followed moved with the careful precision of good police work, combined with the methodical documentation that George had provided. Detective Santos coordinated with federal agencies specializing in cryptocurrency crimes and international money laundering, building a case that extended far beyond Lincoln High School into a network of fraudulent transactions involving millions of dollars in illicit funds. George's evidence proved to be the crucial link that connected Thompson's local operation to a much larger criminal organization. The recordings captured not only Thompson's discussions about laundering money through the school foundation, but also references to other participants in the scheme, including the mysterious, well-dressed man George had observed entering and leaving the school. That man, it turned out, was Vincent Marcus, a financier who specialized in converting illegal cash into cryptocurrency and then transferring the digital assets to accounts in countries with strict banking privacy laws. Marcus had been using nonprofit organizations across the Midwest as fronts for his laundering operation, and Thompson's willingness to participate in exchange for substantial personal profit had made Lincoln High School's foundation a perfect vehicle for his criminal enterprise. The investigation revealed that Thompson had been receiving monthly payments of $15,000 in Bitcoin for her participation in the money laundering scheme. These payments were disguised as consulting fees from a shell company controlled by Marcus, and Thompson had been converting the cryptocurrency to cash through a series of small transactions designed to avoid triggering federal reporting requirements. The $50,000 that had disappeared from the school's donation was not theft in the traditional sense. It was a payment to Marcus for laundering services, part of a transaction that would have seen the money converted to cryptocurrency and transferred overseas before being returned to Thompson's accounts as apparently legitimate investment profits. George's dismissal had been carefully orchestrated to eliminate the one person who might have observed and understood the pattern of unusual financial activity. Thompson had correctly identified him as a potential threat to their operation, but she had underestimated his intelligence, his observational skills, and his commitment to eventually clearing his name. The arrests came on a cold February morning, 6 months after George's dismissal from Lincoln High School. Federal agents and Chicago police officers coordinated simultaneous raids at Thompson's home, Marcus's office, and several other locations connected to their money laundering network. The evidence that George had provided formed the foundation of search warrants that uncovered additional documentation, computer records, and financial evidence that painted a comprehensive picture of their criminal conspiracy. Thompson was arrested at Lincoln High School, taken into custody in her own office by Detective Santos and 2 federal agents. The photograph of her being led away in handcuffs appeared on the front page of the Chicago Tribune, an image that captured the dramatic reversal of fortune that had transformed her from respected educator to accused criminal. Marcus proved more elusive, having fled to a country without extradition treaties with the United States, but his financial network was systematically dismantled by federal investigators who froze accounts, seized assets, and arrested several other participants in the laundering scheme. The story attracted significant media attention, particularly the role that George's courageous whistleblowing had played in exposing the corruption. Reporters praised his dedication to truth and justice, his methodical documentation of criminal activity, and his willingness to risk personal consequences to protect the integrity of public education. But the vindication that George had sought was tinged with bittersweet irony. His reputation was restored, his accusations proven correct, and his character vindicated in the most public way possible. Yet, the damage to his life could not be easily reversed. Months of unemployment, social isolation, and financial hardship had taken their toll in ways that went far beyond simple economic calculation. The Chicago Board of Education offered George his job back at Lincoln High School, along with back pay, benefits, and a formal apology for the injustice he had suffered. But George declined their offer, explaining with characteristic dignity that he felt his time at the school had reached its natural conclusion. Instead, George accepted a position with Detective Santos's Financial Crimes Unit as a civilian consultant specializing in the investigation of nonprofit fraud. His unique combination of observational skills, patience, and understanding of institutional operations made him invaluable in cases involving complex financial crimes hidden within legitimate organizations. The job suited George perfectly. His years of invisible service had taught him to see patterns and details that others missed, skills that proved directly applicable to financial investigation. His modest salary was supplemented by rewards from successful prosecutions and by the satisfaction of knowing that his work was preventing other innocent people from becoming victims of financial crimes. But perhaps the most significant change in George's life was the recognition he finally received for his true character and capabilities. The story of his patient investigation and courageous whistleblowing had transformed him from an invisible janitor into a respected figure in Chicago's law enforcement community. His colleagues in the Financial Crimes Unit valued his insights, his methodical approach to evidence gathering, and his unshakable commitment to truth and justice. George's apartment in back of the yards was renovated with his back pay and consultant fees, transformed from a modest refuge into a comfortable home filled with the books he had always loved and the music that reminded him of Ellen. He purchased a small garden plot in a community space near his neighborhood, growing vegetables and flowers that connected him to the natural world that had been largely absent from his years of institutional service. On quiet evenings, George would sit in his comfortable chair, jazz music playing softly while he read mysteries and biographies, surrounded by photographs of Ellen and mementos from his new career. The loneliness that had characterized his final years at Lincoln High had been replaced by meaningful work, genuine friendships, and the deep satisfaction of a man who had faced injustice with dignity and emerged victorious through his own patient effort. The students and faculty at Lincoln High School eventually learned the truth about George's accusations and his role in exposing the corruption that had infected their institution. Many expressed regret about their failure to support him during his ordeal, acknowledging that their silence had contributed to the injustice he had suffered. Mrs. Rodriguez visited George at his new office, bringing homemade tamales and heartfelt thanks for his courage in exposing the truth. Mr. Chen from the library sent a card expressing admiration for his integrity and persistence. Even some of the students who had witnessed his disgrace took the time to write letters apologizing for their assumptions and praising his dedication to their school. But George's response to these gestures was characteristically gracious and forward-looking. He bore no grudges against those who had failed to support him, understanding that fear and institutional pressure had constrained their actions. His focus was on the future, on his new work, and on the satisfaction of knowing that his patience and persistence had ultimately triumphed over injustice. Detective Santos became not only a professional colleague, but a genuine friend. Someone who understood and appreciated the unique talents that George brought to their investigative work. Their partnership proved remarkably successful, resulting in the prosecution of numerous financial crimes and the recovery of millions of dollars in stolen assets. "George," she told him during one of their successful cases, "you have a gift for seeing things that other people miss. You notice patterns, details, motivation. You understand how institutions really work, not just how they're supposed to work." George's reply reflected the wisdom he had gained through decades of observation and recent triumph over adversity. "Detective Santos, when you spend years being invisible, you learn to see everything. Most people look at surfaces. I learned to look underneath." As the seasons passed and George settled into his new life, he began to understand that his ordeal at Lincoln High School, painful as it had ultimately led him to work that was more meaningful and fulfilling than anything he had done before. His invisible years as a janitor had been preparation for his visible years as an investigator. His patient observation had become skilled detection, and his quiet dignity had evolved into confident expertise. The irony was not lost on him that his greatest professional success had come from the very qualities that had made him seem unremarkable during his janitorial career. attention to detail, methodical documentation, patient persistence, and an ability to see truth beneath surface appearances. George often thought about the lessons his experience had taught him about the nature of justice and the importance of persistence in the face of adversity. His story had become an inspiration to others who felt invisible or undervalued in their work, a reminder that dignity and integrity could ultimately triumph over power and prejudice. On the 5th anniversary of his dismissal from Lincoln High School, George received an unexpected visitor at his consulting office. It was Sarah Thompson, Margaret Thompson's adult daughter, who had come to apologize for her mother's actions and to thank George for his role in exposing the corruption that had ultimately led to significant reforms in educational foundation management across Illinois. "Mr. Miller," Sarah said, her voice carrying genuine remorse, "I wanted you to know that my mother's actions don't represent our family's values. What she did to you was wrong, and what you did to expose the truth was incredibly brave." George listened with the same patient attention he had always applied to human interactions, understanding that Sarah's visit represented her own process of coming to terms with her mother's crimes. His response was characteristically gracious. "Sarah, your mother made choices that she has to live with. You're not responsible for those choices, and you shouldn't carry guilt that isn't yours to bear." Their conversation lasted for nearly an hour, during which Sarah learned about George's new work and his philosophy of forgiveness without forgetfulness. She left understanding that George harbored no anger toward her or her family, but that he remained committed to ensuring that similar injustices would be prevented through his investigative work. As George approached his 70th birthday, he began to consider retirement from active investigation work, though he planned to continue consulting on complex cases and training new investigators in the observational techniques he had developed. His reputation in the law enforcement community was such that the Chicago Police Department was planning to establish the George Miller Fellowship for training officers in financial crimes investigation. The fellowship would focus on teaching investigators to see beyond obvious evidence, to pay attention to patterns that might be missed by conventional approaches, and to understand that the most valuable witnesses are often those who seem least important to traditional hierarchical thinking. George's story had become a case study in criminal justice programs at several universities, used to illustrate the importance of protecting whistleblowers and the value of patient, methodical investigation techniques. His techniques for documentation and evidence preservation were taught to new investigators as standard procedures for complex financial crimes. But perhaps the most significant legacy of George's experience was the impact it had on legislation protecting employees who report criminal activity within their organizations. His case had highlighted the vulnerability of working-class whistleblowers and had led to stronger protections for those who risked their livelihoods to expose corruption. The George Miller Whistleblower Protection Act, passed by the Illinois legislature 4 years after Thompson's arrest, provided legal and financial protection for employees who report criminal activity within nonprofit organizations. The law ensured that witnesses like George would have access to legal representation, temporary financial support, and protection from retaliation while their cases were being investigated. George was present at the bill's signing, standing beside the governor as legislation bearing his name became law. It was a moment of public recognition that stood in stark contrast to the years of invisibility that had characterized his earlier career. But George approached the ceremony with the same quiet dignity that had sustained him through his ordeal. In his brief remarks at the signing ceremony, George spoke about the importance of truth-telling in a democratic society and the responsibility of institutions to protect those who speak truth to power. His words carried the authority of someone who had faced the consequences of courageous action and had emerged with his integrity intact. "When we see wrongdoing," George said, his voice carrying clearly through the room, "we have a choice to make. We can look away, protect ourselves, and hope someone else will act. Or we can document what we see, preserve the evidence, and trust that truth will eventually find its way to light." The ceremony was attended by many of George's colleagues from the Financial Crimes Unit, several journalists who had covered his story, and representatives from organizations that advocated for worker rights and government accountability. Mrs. Rodriguez was there, still bringing homemade tamales, proud to see her former colleague honored for his courage and persistence. But the person George missed most at that moment was Ellen, whose photograph he carried in his wallet, and whose memory had sustained him through the darkest periods of his ordeal. He knew that she would have been proud of his transformation from invisible janitor to respected investigator, proud of his refusal to be defeated by injustice, and proud of the legislation that would protect other workers who found themselves in situations similar to his own. As George entered the final phase of his career, he began writing a memoir about his experience, working with a journalist to ensure that his story would be preserved for future generations of workers who might face similar challenges. The book, tentatively titled The Invisible Witness, would chronicle not only his personal journey, but also the broader issues of workplace justice and the importance of protecting those who report criminal activity. The memoir project allowed George to reflect on the full arc of his experience, from the early years of patient service at Lincoln High School through the injustice of his dismissal and the ultimate vindication of his accusations. Writing forced him to examine not only the external events, but also the internal process of maintaining dignity and hope in the face of seemingly overwhelming adversity. George's story served as a reminder that heroism often comes not from dramatic moments of courage, but from the patient accumulation of small acts of integrity over time. His 23 years of faithful service, his careful documentation of suspicious activity, his methodical preservation of evidence, and his ultimate willingness to risk everything to expose the truth, all of these represented a kind of heroism that was available to ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. The impact of George's experience extended far beyond his personal vindication or even the prosecution of Thompson and Marcus. His case had changed the way law enforcement agencies approached financial crimes involving nonprofit organizations, had led to legislative protection for whistleblowers, and had inspired countless other workers to trust their observations and speak up about suspicious activity in their workplaces. But perhaps most importantly, George's story had shown that invisibility could be transformed into influence, that patience could triumph over power, and that dignity maintained in the face of injustice could ultimately prove more powerful than wealth or position. As he sat in his comfortable apartment on winter evenings, jazz music playing softly while he worked on his memoir, George Miller understood that his life had found a meaning and purpose that went far beyond anything he could have imagined during his years as an invisible janitor. His patient observation had become skilled investigation, his quiet dignity had evolved into respected expertise, and his commitment to truth had transformed him into a symbol of integrity for workers everywhere who felt overlooked, undervalued, or vulnerable to the abuse of power. The man who had once pushed a mop through empty hallways now shaped policy and trained investigators. The employee who had been dismissed without evidence now provided evidence that sent criminals to prison. The worker who had been treated as invisible now stood as a visible reminder that justice, though sometimes delayed, could ultimately prevail when pursued with patience, courage, and unwavering commitment to truth. George's final years were filled with meaningful work, genuine friendships, and the deep satisfaction that comes from a life lived with integrity. He had faced the worst that institutional power could inflict upon an individual worker and had emerged not only victorious, but transformed into someone whose influence extended far beyond his personal circumstances. The janitor who had been told to just clean and leave had instead stayed to clean up corruption, expose criminal activity, and leave behind a legacy that would protect countless other workers for generations to come. His story stood as proof that ordinary people, armed with patience, integrity, and commitment to truth, could triumph over even the most sophisticated forms of corruption and abuse. As the memoir neared completion, George found himself reflecting on the unexpected turns that had shaped his later years. The quiet man who had spent decades maintaining the physical infrastructure of education had become someone who helped maintain the moral infrastructure of society. His transition from maintenance work to investigative consulting had revealed talents and abilities that had been hidden beneath years of institutional invisibility. George's collaboration with Detective Santos had evolved beyond professional partnership into genuine mentorship. Santos often brought younger investigators to observe George's techniques for pattern recognition and evidence documentation. His ability to see connections that others missed had become legendary within the Financial Crimes Unit, where his methods were studied and replicated. "Watch him work," Santos would tell new investigators. "George doesn't just see what's there, he sees what's not there, what should be there, what's been moved or changed." 23 years of noticing details that everyone else ignored taught him to read institutions like books. The training sessions George conducted for law enforcement officers drew participants from across the Midwest. His presentations on invisible observation and pattern recognition in financial crimes were requested by agencies from Milwaukee to St. Louis. George would stand before rooms full of detectives and federal agents, sharing techniques he had developed not through formal training, but through decades of watching human behavior in institutional settings. His reputation had grown to such an extent that defense attorneys occasionally tried to challenge his credentials, suggesting that a former janitor couldn't possibly understand the complexities of financial crime. But George's responses to such challenges revealed the depth of his intellectual capacity and the sophistication of his analytical abilities. "Your Honor," he had said during one memorable court appearance, "I spent 23 years observing people when they thought no one was watching. I learned to distinguish between normal behavior and suspicious behavior, between regular patterns and irregular patterns. Financial crimes are just patterns of human behavior, and I've been studying human behavior my entire adult life." The testimony had been so compelling that the presiding judge later commented that George Miller possessed one of the sharpest investigative minds he had encountered in 30 years on the bench. As George's 70th birthday approached, the Chicago Police Department organized a celebration that reflected the high regard in which he was held throughout the law enforcement community. The event, held in the ballroom of the Palmer House Hotel, drew attendees from federal agencies, local police departments, and advocacy organizations focused on worker rights and government accountability. Detective Santos served as master of ceremonies, introducing speakers who testified to George's impact on their work and their understanding of justice. A federal prosecutor spoke about how George's techniques had helped secure convictions in cases involving millions of dollars in fraudulent transactions. A state legislator credited George's courage with inspiring legislation that had protected dozens of other whistleblowers across Illinois. But the most moving tribute came from Maria Gonzalez, a young woman who had been a student at Lincoln High School during George's tenure there. Maria had grown up to become a social worker, inspired, she said, by George's example of quiet service and dedication to others. "Mr. Miller probably doesn't remember me," Maria said, her voice carrying across the ballroom, "but I remember him. When other adults in that building treated students like problems to be managed, George treated us like human beings who mattered. He would smile when we passed in the hallways, help us when we dropped books or papers, and once, when I was crying about something that seemed like the end of the world, he offered me tissues and told me that whatever was wrong, it would get better if I was patient and persistent." She paused, looking directly at George, who sat at the head table with tears in his eyes. Those words stayed with me through college, through social work school, through every difficult case I've encountered in my career. Patient and persistent, that's who George Miller is, and that's what he taught all of us who were lucky enough to know him. The standing ovation that followed Maria's remarks lasted for several minutes, a lengthy tribute from an audience that understood the rare quality of character being honored that evening. George's response, when he finally took the podium, was characteristically humble and focused on the work that remained to be done. He spoke about the importance of seeing dignity in all forms of work, about the responsibility of institutions to protect those who serve them faithfully, and about the ongoing need to create systems that would prevent other workers from experiencing the injustice he had faced. "I've been blessed to see my story become something larger than my personal experience," George said, his voice steady and clear. "But the real measure of success will be whether future workers in similar situations receive the support and protection they deserve from the very beginning of their ordeals." The celebration continued late into the evening, with colleagues sharing stories of George's investigative insights, his patient mentoring of younger officers, and his philosophical approach to justice that emphasized restoration over revenge. As the evening wound down, Detective Santos found George standing on the hotel's balcony, looking out over the city that had been his home for so many decades. The lights of Chicago stretched toward the horizon, a brilliant constellation of human activity and ambition. "Regrets?" Santos asked, joining him at the railing. George considered the question thoughtfully. "I regret the pain that injustice caused to people who cared about me. I regret the opportunities that were lost during those months when I was fighting to clear my name. But I don't regret the path that led me to the work I'm doing now. Sometimes we have to lose one kind of life to find another kind of life that fits us better." Santos nodded, understanding that George's philosophical acceptance of hardship was part of what made him such an effective investigator and teacher. His ability to find meaning in suffering, to transform personal adversity into service to others, represented a form of wisdom that couldn't be taught in any academy or textbook. The memoir was published 6 months after George's birthday celebration, receiving positive reviews from critics who praised its honest portrayal of working-class life and its insights into the dynamics of institutional power. The Invisible Witness became required reading in several criminal justice programs and was adopted by organizations training advocates for worker rights. Book tours took George to universities, police academies, and conference centers across the country, where he spoke about the techniques he had developed for documenting suspicious activity and the psychological challenges of speaking truth to power. His audiences ranged from students contemplating careers in law enforcement to experienced investigators seeking to refine their observational skills. At each stop, George encountered people who shared their own stories of workplace injustice, institutional corruption, or moral dilemmas that tested their integrity. His responses were always thoughtful and practical, drawing from his experience to offer concrete advice while acknowledging the unique circumstances each person faced. "The most important thing," he would often say, "is to remember that your dignity belongs to you. Other people can attack your reputation, question your motives, even threaten your livelihood, but your dignity is something only you can give away. If you hold on to that, you maintain the foundation for everything else." These interactions reinforced George's understanding that his story had resonated far beyond the specific circumstances of his case at Lincoln High School. His experience had become a symbol of the potential for ordinary people to resist institutional abuse and to transform personal adversity into broader social change. The financial crimes consulting work continued to provide George with intellectual challenges and professional satisfaction, but it was the teaching and mentoring aspects of his new career that brought him the greatest joy. Working with young investigators, helping them develop the observational skills and analytical techniques that would serve them throughout their careers, gave George a sense of legacy that extended far beyond any individual case he might solve. One of his most successful protégés was Detective James Rodriguez, Mrs. Rodriguez's nephew, who had been inspired by George's example to pursue a career in law enforcement. Under George's mentoring, James had developed into one of the department's most skilled financial crimes investigators, specializing in cases involving nonprofit fraud and money laundering. George taught me that investigation is really about understanding people, James explained to a reporter writing about George's influence on the department. You have to understand why people behave the way they do, what motivates them, what scares them. The financial records and technical evidence are important, but they're just the surface. The real story is always about human behavior. This insight, that financial crimes were ultimately about human nature rather than just technical manipulation, had become central to the training programs George developed for law enforcement agencies. His courses emphasized psychological observation alongside technical analysis, teaching investigators to read body language, voice patterns, and behavioral changes that might indicate deception or criminal activity. The success of these training programs led to invitations from international law enforcement organizations interested in George's techniques. He traveled to conferences in London, Toronto, and Sydney, sharing his methods with investigators who faced similar challenges in their own jurisdictions. These international experiences broadened George's perspective on the universal nature of institutional corruption and the common challenges faced by working-class whistleblowers around the world. His techniques, developed in the specific context of an American public school, proved remarkably applicable to investigations in different cultures and legal systems. As George entered his mid-70s, he began to transition from active consulting to a more advisory role, serving on boards that oversaw whistleblower protection programs and consulting on policy initiatives aimed at preventing institutional abuse. His apartment, which had once been a modest refuge, had been transformed into a sort of informal archive of materials related to financial crimes investigation and worker protection. The walls were lined with books on psychology, criminology, and institutional behavior, interspersed with photographs from his various speaking engagements and award ceremonies. A large desk, much more substantial than the small kitchen table where he had once organized his evidence against Thompson, held correspondence from investigators, students, and advocates who sought his advice on complex cases. Ellen's photograph still occupied a place of honor on the desk, surrounded now by mementos from a life that had found new purpose and meaning in its later phases. George often spoke to her photograph during quiet evenings, sharing details about his work and the ongoing satisfaction he found in helping others navigate the challenges he had once faced alone. "You would be proud," he would say to her image. "The work we're doing is making a difference for people who find themselves in situations like I faced. No one should have to go through what we went through without support and protection." The sense of conversation with Ellen, of continuing their partnership despite her physical absence, had sustained George through the difficult years following his dismissal and continued to provide comfort as he contemplated the eventual conclusion of his professional life. George's influence on legislation had extended beyond the Illinois Whistleblower Protection Act to federal initiatives aimed at strengthening protections for employees who report criminal activity. His testimony before congressional committees had been instrumental in shaping aspects of financial crimes legislation that specifically addressed the vulnerability of working-class witnesses. "Mr. Miller represents the best of American values," one senator had said during hearings on whistleblower protection. "His story demonstrates that ordinary citizens, armed with courage and commitment to truth, can hold powerful institutions accountable and protect the public interest." This recognition at the federal level had led to consulting opportunities with agencies responsible for implementing whistleblower protection programs, where George's practical experience complemented the theoretical knowledge of policy experts and legal scholars. His recommendations consistently emphasized the importance of providing immediate practical support to whistleblowers, understanding that people in George's original situation often couldn't wait months or years for their cases to be resolved through formal legal processes. "When someone loses their job for reporting criminal activity," George would explain to policymakers. They need help with rent and groceries right away, not just eventual vindication. The system has to be designed with the understanding that doing the right thing often comes with immediate personal costs that require immediate assistance. These insights, grounded in George's lived experience, had influenced the design of support programs that provided financial assistance, legal representation, and counseling services to whistleblowers during the period when their cases were being investigated. As George approached his 80th birthday, his colleagues in the Financial Crimes Unit began planning another celebration, recognizing that his active consulting career was drawing to a natural close. But George surprised them by announcing that he had one more project he wanted to complete before fully retiring from professional life. Working with Detective Santos and a team of researchers from several universities, George wanted to create a comprehensive database of investigative techniques and case studies that would preserve his methods and insights for future generations of investigators. The project would combine his practical experience with academic analysis, creating a resource that would be available to law enforcement agencies worldwide. "I've been blessed with opportunities to learn and teach," George explained to the project team. "But knowledge that isn't preserved and shared dies with the person who possesses it. I want to make sure that the techniques we've developed and the lessons we've learned continue to help people long after I'm gone." The database project became George's final professional legacy, a comprehensive collection of investigative methods, training materials, case studies, and philosophical insights that reflected his unique approach to understanding and combating financial crimes. The work was painstaking and methodical, qualities that had characterized George's approach to every challenge throughout his career. Each technique was documented with detailed explanations, illustrated with case studies, and accompanied by training materials that would allow other instructors to teach George's methods effectively. The project took 3 years to complete, during which George worked with the same patient persistence that had sustained him through his years at Lincoln High School and his subsequent career as an investigator. The final product was a resource that exceeded even the ambitious goals the team had set for themselves. When the George Miller Investigative Database was formally launched at a ceremony attended by law enforcement officials from around the world, the event represented not just the conclusion of George's professional career, but the beginning of a new phase of his influence that would extend far into the future. "George Miller has given us something precious," the FBI director said during his remarks at the launch ceremony. "He has given us his wisdom, his experience, and his understanding of how to see truth even when it's hidden beneath layers of deception and institutional protection. That gift will serve justice for generations to come." George's response reflected the same humility that had characterized his approach to recognition throughout his later career. "This database represents the work of many people who helped me understand what I had observed and experienced. I'm grateful to have been part of creating something that might help other investigators and other workers who find themselves facing the challenges I once faced." The months following the database launch were among the most peaceful of George's adult life. Free from the pressures of active casework and formal responsibilities, he was able to focus on the simple pleasures that had sustained him during his years of invisible service: reading, gardening, listening to jazz music, and maintaining connections with the friends and colleagues who had become his chosen family. His small garden plot had expanded over the years into a substantial community garden where George spent mornings tending vegetables and flowers while sharing conversation with neighbors who had come to value his quiet wisdom and practical advice. The garden provided a connection to natural cycles and simple growth that balanced the complexity of his investigative work. Evenings were spent reading books that had nothing to do with financial crimes or institutional corruption: science fiction novels, biographies of jazz musicians, histories of Chicago architecture. The intellectual curiosity that had made George such an effective observer and investigator found new outlets in subjects he had never had time to explore during his working years. But perhaps the most significant change in George's retirement was the time he spent with young people who sought his advice and mentorship. Students from criminal justice programs, young investigators beginning their careers, and activists working on worker protection issues regularly visited George's apartment for conversations that often extended for hours. These informal mentoring sessions became legendary among Chicago's law enforcement and advocacy communities. George's ability to listen patiently, ask thoughtful questions, and offer practical advice grounded in real experience made him a sought-after counselor for people facing complex professional and ethical challenges. "George doesn't just give you answers," explained one young investigator who had benefited from these sessions. "He helps you find your own answers by asking the right questions and sharing relevant experiences. He helps you understand not just what to do, but why it matters and how to maintain your integrity while doing it." As George entered his mid-80s, his health remained remarkably good, sustained by decades of physical work, simple living, and the deep satisfaction that came from a life that had found meaning and purpose despite its challenges. His mind remained sharp, his insights into human nature and institutional behavior as keen as ever. The legacy George Miller had created extended far beyond any individual case he had solved or any specific person he had helped. His story had become part of the larger narrative of American justice, a reminder that ordinary people possessed extraordinary power to resist corruption and protect the public interest. Schools named libraries and fellowship programs in his honor. Law enforcement agencies incorporated his training methods into their standard procedures. Advocacy organizations cited his example when encouraging workers to report suspicious activity. His influence had become woven into the institutional fabric of the systems he had once struggled against as an individual. But George understood that the most important measure of his legacy was not the awards, recognition, or formal honors he had received. The true measure was whether other workers in situations similar to his original predicament would receive the support, protection, and respect they deserved. On quiet evenings, as Chicago's lights twinkled beyond his windows and jazz music played softly in the background, George Miller could reflect with deep satisfaction on a life that had achieved something rare and precious: the transformation of personal injustice into lasting justice for others, the conversion of individual suffering into collective protection, and the evolution of invisible service into visible influence that would endure long after he was gone. The janitor, who had been told to just clean and leave, had instead cleaned up corruption, left behind institutions and laws that protected other workers, and demonstrated that patient integrity could ultimately triumph over the most sophisticated forms of abuse and deception. His story stood as permanent testimony to the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change when they refused to accept injustice as inevitable. And you, have you ever felt invisible while you were the one holding everything together? Have you witnessed injustice but questioned whether your voice would matter? Tell me your story in the comments. If this touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe so it reaches someone who also deserves to be seen. For more stories like this that honor the dignity of quiet heroes, tap the podcast link on the left. Thank you for walking with us through George's journey. See you in the next story.